Welcome to Talking Foreign Affairs. I'm your host, Adil Cader. Joining me, we are delighted to have the Honourable Scott Morrison, Australia's 30th Prime Minister. We will be discussing his handling of the AUKUS agreement, the subsequent fallout in the region, and relationships with China. Mr. Morrison, thank you so much for joining Talking Foreign Affairs.
Thank you. That's a very good initiative. Pleased to be here.
Thank you. So, Mr. Morrison, how did this idea of AUKUS come about? Was it a long-term strategy or something that was sort of more short-term?
Well, it was certainly the product of its time and events and the challenges that Australia was facing, but equally it was consistent with much more longer-term interests of Australia, but particularly of our government in what we were seeking to achieve in our region. Now, we do all of these things principally to ensure that we protect Australia's national interests and we can contribute towards stability in our region. It protects the sovereignty of other countries in our region, not just Australia, because that's the basis of prosperity. That's the base. Stability is incredibly important to a nation's prosperity and the well-being and livelihoods of people right across the region, particularly here in Australia. So these types of initiatives aren't abstract to the most significant things that people do with every single day in their lives. And the absence of stability and these types of arrangements, then that very livelihood and way of life we enjoy in Australia would be under direct threat. So AUKUS came out of a situation where we experienced significant economic coercion from a very assertive Chinese government. The world basically changed in 2012 when Xi Jinping became president of China, and we had gone, or I should say it became more revealed as to what their aspirations and intentions were, and they've been pursued in a very strong way by President Xi. This is to basically extend its influence beyond the second island chain and establish hegemony within the Indo-Pacific region, which obviously presents a threat to the sovereignty and well-being of all nations that seek to exist freely in the Indo-Pacific. And so that was what we were dealing with. And that happened within the context of global power competition between China and the United States, of course, and Australia being an ally of the United States in the region. The other thing that we were contending with was a procurement of a fleet of conventionally powered diesel submarines. Now, the French submarines, TAC-class submarines, these submarines had been, we'd entered into that decision back in 2015 from memory, and that decision appeared the right decision for a conventionally powered submarine at the time. There was no contemplation of a nuclear-powered submarine. That was seen to be beyond our opportunity. But the world changed a lot between that time and when we finally made the decision on AUKUS. There had been delays in the contract and a lot of frustrations. That wasn't the reason we changed, but it created an opportunity where we had to contemplate a plan B, another option, should the diesel-powered submarine program become too difficult to operate in achieving the procurement successfully. And the contract was built so it had gates along the way. So the French contractor had to meet particular milestones, and they were not shaping up well for a key milestone. And so I began to contemplate what the alternatives would be. And I thought this was a once in a nation's opportunity to actually get access to the most significant defence technology there is in the world, which is nuclear-powered submarines. And as a result, we set about achieving that. In the formation of that agreement to acquire that capability, it became very clear to me that this was something that we wanted to do on all defence technology, just not on nuclear-powered submarines. And the unique combination that was brought together between Australia, the United States and the UK, I believe could be replicated many times over in the origination, development and operationalisation of all forms of new defence technologies that would be critical to achieving our goals of stability both within our region and more broadly.
So the first set of submarines aren't expected to come until the late 2030s or early 2040s. Is that a point of concern for you?
Well, it was the same timetable that we ultimately expected with the delays, what was going to happen with the French submarines. So, yes, that presented a capability gap, which we were going to have to be addressing regardless. And we had options for dealing with that, and which are being pursued in part with the Collins-class submarines now to extend their lives. The Collins classes will continue to do a very excellent job, which they have been doing for some time now, within the region for us and as in concert with others. But that meeting of a capability gap between now and when the nuclear-powered submarines were originally intended to be available is overcome by the access to the Virginia-class submarines in the interim, which was always envisaged by the AUKUS agreement. It was always envisaged that we would be seeing what role the Virginia-class submarines might be able to play in the AUKUS agreement on submarines. And there was a considerable amount of work done before the election on that, and that has been followed through by the new government. So I'm very pleased with the agreement and the arrangement that was arrived at.
So I know and you've spoken about this before, both Australia and America's allies have approached the US previously in the past, asking for this similar agreement in regards to submarines, but they've said no on all occasions. What made this instance so special?
I think the first reason is the strategic environment in which we all found ourselves. There was, I think, a greater recognition, I think, by the United States most recently, about the need to build the broader capability of allies and partners within the regions. This isn't about Australia acquiring submarines from the United States or the UK for that matter. It's about ensuring that all three countries have more of them as a whole. So it's a value add proposition in terms of capability across the trilateral partners. And so there was a recognition and an awareness of the need for that because of the tensions in the Indo-Pacific and the need to sort of continue to impact on the calculus within the Indo-Pacific. And so that was an important point. The other important point was that that Australia had demonstrated a commitment to be able to do this. We initiated this discussion. This did not come from the United States. This came from our government and direct from myself as Prime Minister. It was probably the only other time when Australia had been so proactive in leading the agenda of the US-Australia alliance was the formation of ANZUS itself. And so we took the initiative, and that demonstrated a clear commitment. But that was backed up by what we demonstrated in lifting defence spending as a share of our economy to over 2%, which had been a key commitment when we came first to government. And equally, we had been able to deal with some difficult challenges within our own submarine program with the turnaround of the Collins-class submarines operations and ensuring that more of them can be at sea more often. And that was a very difficult challenge. And I think our submarine force attracted a lot of credit from the Americans, or at least acknowledgement that Australia can do this. And we sat in a fairly unique space as a partner of trust and capability.
So you mentioned about the ANZUS alliance, and similarly with AUKUS, critics of AUKUS do argue that it impacts Australia's strategic autonomy, that Australia loses sovereignty, and that all hope for strategic autonomy in the future is lost because of this reliance on a major superpower. What are your responses to this?
Well, I think the view that you've summarised, it's not your view, I assume, but the view that you've summarised, the critics of the alliance, I think is foolhardy and wrong-headed and ignorant. The suggestion that any country in the world today can operate as an island and be able to resist any and all threats, forces that may come against us is childish. I mean, it's just ridiculous. To conflate an awareness of that basic fact with some idea of subservience or colonialism or something is just rhetorical rubbish. What this is about is a clear-eyed assessment of the risks facing Australia and how you can deal with them. And you deal with them with friends, partners, alliances, alignments, and ensuring that you can have a set of forces in place that protect Australia's interests. And I can think of nothing more sovereign than that. I mean, the alternative, the sort of childish pursuit of that notion of autonomy would lead to a loss of Australia's sovereignty. We would be so easily overwhelmed in that arrangement that it doesn't bear thinking about.
On the note of AUKUS, after the agreement was done, there was obviously those who praised the agreement, but there was those, especially the President of France, Emmanuel Macron, who had quite some strong words for you to say. Now, that's obviously not something which Diplomacy 101 would sort of suggest. How did you go about handling that interaction?
Well, there's no way to tell a partner that you're cancelling a $90 billion contract and they walk away happy. And it'd be naive to think that if we gave too much of a heads up on that in their own commercial interests, they wouldn't seek to undermine the arrangement we were seeking to put together. And that's the difficulty of leadership. You sometimes have to make difficult choices between your interests and sometimes your friends. I was very clear with President Macron that Australia no longer believed that the diesel-powered conventional submarines that we were building with them would be able to meet our strategic interests in the future. I made that very clear to him at a dinner that we had in June of 2021. The day after that meeting, the French defence establishment went into overdrive, contacting pretty much every person with an Australian accent they could find. So it was pretty clear to me that the French had an interest here in preserving a contract. Our security, our objectives were secondary to them. They didn't appreciate, in my view, the challenges that we were facing, and it's regrettable that what we were doing together was no longer to meet Australia's interests, but that was the facts. And so I was very aware that when we came to that point of cancelling the contract, yes, it would harm the relationship. But the bigger issue to address was Australia's security interests in the Indo-Pacific, which were best served by AUKUS. So it was a choice between the President of France being happy or having AUKUS and nuclear-powered submarines and a once in a multi-generation opportunity to have a defence agreement that would serve Australia for generations to come.
I think that's very, very good insight about having to balance different interests, and that sometimes you can't always make everyone happy in diplomacy.
It's true.
But on that note, there was also some concern within the Indo-Pacific. If I'm not mistaken, the Indonesian government had some concerns as well. How did you go about handling that? Just obviously, you compare Australia and France, but Australia and Indonesia, there's much more strategic importance there. So how did you handle that?
I'm talking to them constantly and directly and explaining. The region was then, after the announcement of AUKUS, was subject to a barrage of misinformation, particularly from China and France, which was designed to undermine the arrangement that we had and seek to undermine confidence in it with our partners, which we addressed. And just through the relationship that we had, the timing of the announcement, which wasn't totally within our control, and some other meetings that had occurred prior to that, made that task a little more difficult than it might otherwise have been. But that's also the nature of these things too. You don't get necessarily the exact timetable that suits your objectives, but you deal with what comes your way. And so then it was about reaching out to President Jokowi and others in the region too, in Malaysia, and we talk Singapore and many other countries who are quite understanding and receptive to what we had to say, and we continue to do that. And the new government has done that, and that's good. But the fact that there was so many attempts to scuttle this after it started, particularly out of China, I think speaks to its great significance and impact and positive contribution, not just to Australia's national security interests, but I think the region's more broadly against a very significant power seeking hegemony.
I know your government as well pushed for closer ties with Japan, and there have been some calls for Japan or a JAWKUS, as they would say, to join AUKUS, or for New Zealand to join AUKUS. What's your opinion on countries like Japan and New Zealand potentially being part of AUKUS?
Well, you're right to highlight the relationship with Japan. I mean, in dealing with the coercion and the issues we faced, I mean, AUKUS was obviously the paramount piece in all of that. But there are other things going on as well, which you've already noted. The Quad and Australia with Japan played a key role in elevating the Quad to a leaders' dialogue. The Quad had been in existence for some time, but its elevation to a leaders' dialogue completely changed the nature of that forum. So there was that. There was the reciprocal access agreement that we went into with Japan. There were also a series of economic partnerships we went into with Japan. Similarly, with India, we pursued both intelligence and security relationships and were able to achieve the first free trade agreement with India while we were in government. So working very closely with these very significant partners in the region was a big part of our alignment strategy across the Indo-Pacific and more broadly globally to ensure that Australia was able to resist what was occurring in our part of the world. So Japan, I couldn't underscore any more greatly how important they are in our strategic paradigm here, our strategic network for Australia. And whether Japan at some point ever became part of AUKUS, I think, is for well down the track. Sure. And I don't think there are those aspirations anyway. I mean, I spoke to Prime Minister Suga the night before we announced AUKUS. He was very, very supportive of it, as was Prime Minister Kishida. And it was very much in the spirit, I think, of what Prime Minister Abe, who I also dealt with, and he's free and open in the Pacific, was very much achieving those objectives. So we've always had enormous support from Japan for all of these things. Now, Japan is going through their own sort of transformations when it comes to their defence. And they are significantly ramping up their own defence spending, and there are constitutional issues they're addressing there within their polity, and I think that's all moving in the right direction. And so I think there's a lot more water to pass under the bridge there, but we welcome, affirm, encourage, support, endorse all of what they're doing in that space. And we very much, I believe, should see Japan as one of our most significant partners in defence and technology, certainly in the economy, as we seek to create a more stable and prosperous region here in the Indo-Pacific. In terms of New Zealand, well, they just operate at a different scale, and I could never see that occurring. And New Zealand are part of the Five Eyes relationship that has been around for a very, very long time, and they play a role within that relationship. But AUKUS, and this in no way reflects on any other country, but AUKUS is a highest common denominator partnership. It requires significant commitments of both your country's own capital, but also your forces, and you need to be operating at a level of security amongst the most trusted of countries together in the world. And so that can never be diluted, and that is really the mark. But I can see the situation where AUKUS enters into dialogue with Japan. I can see AUKUS partners engaging in AUKUS-related projects with Japan. I could definitely see that happening, and that is, a possible prelude to something further down the road.
Speaking on the Five Eyes and talking about specifically New Zealand, during your time in office, there was a disagreement between Australia and New Zealand in regards to the handling of Huawei and the 5G networks, given the security concerns. How did you go about handling this and the relationship with New Zealand?
Look, New Zealand and Australia are like siblings in a good way, and from time to time, I think there's differences in nuance. And New Zealand is not Australia as well. New Zealand's presence in the Indo-Pacific and its relationship with allies like the United States is different to Australia by their own choice. And their economy is very different to Australia's. Their major exports to, say, the region, particularly China, are very different to ours. Ours are principally resource-based and have a higher degree of resilience. I didn't say they have no resilience. They're not subject to any vulnerability, but Iron ore, for example, which is a massive part of the trade with China. I mean, Australia has a trade surplus with China. So New Zealand, I think, is in some ways a more vulnerable position. But that's the whole point of things like AUKUS and the Quad. It's where the countries like Australia and Japan and India and United States can actually take these strong positions. That enables countries like New Zealand and others in the region to benefit from the strong position that we take. So, I mean, when I would talk to Prime Minister Ardern, we would talk at great length about what was happening in the Indo-Pacific. And ultimately, I think we found ourselves on the same page.
Sure. I want to move to the COVID pandemic. You obviously had a challenging time having to manage Australia's diplomacy in one of the greatest health pandemics the world's ever seen. So you just go over your experience with vaccine diplomacy, how that worked and how it worked coordinating this with other countries.
Well, the focus of our vaccine programs, other than in Australia, was in the South Pacific, and to a lesser extent, proportionally, within Southeast Asia. And I say that in that our ability to impact on the vaccine needs of Indonesia was significantly different to what it was in the Solomon Islands, Fiji, Tonga, Samoa, places like that, Papua New Guinea. So we could have much greater impact in those smaller Pacific Island nations in terms of meeting and helping them with their vaccine needs than we could potentially have in places like Indonesia. But we did provide that support to Indonesia, as we did to many Southeast Asian countries, including Vietnam as well. So there was an outreach program, and I remember on one occasion Prime Minister Bainimarama, the former Prime Minister there in Fiji, when offers were made by China to provide the Sino vaccines, he said, no, we're fine. The Australians have got us covered. And the same was true in Solomon Islands and everywhere else. There was a deep appreciation by Pacific Island nations for the role Australia played in being the principal provider of their vaccine requirements. And I really do applaud the work that was done by health departments, our foreign affairs missions throughout the region, to ensure the effective delivery. Because in Pacific nations and developing countries, it wasn't just getting them vaccines. It was also the delivery, dissemination and administration of the vaccines. The health systems are not like in Australia. So that system weakness made it even harder. And in many Pacific Island countries, there are also cultural factors that were working against the vaccine as well. And that was very, very challenging for those countries. Even when they had the vaccines, the level of vaccine resistance, say in Papua New Guinea, for example, was an extraordinary challenge for them.
Still keeping on the pandemic, one of the main highlights of your time in government was calling for the international COVID inquiry. Now, I know there was some opposition to this in other countries. How did you go about handling this experience?
Well, at the end of the day, even China signed on to the motion at the World Health Assembly. And how effective the international bodies have been in holding China account on this is probably a different issue. But I was very concerned about what the origins of COVID were, because, and we still don't know, and there are many theories, whether it's the lab leak or the wildlife wet market, but certainly the prevailing view at the time on everything I saw in the intelligence I had was that it was likely to have been a wildlife wet market. Now, there are lots of them in our region, not just in China. And so it occurred to me that this was incredibly important that we understand this, because we would possibly be facing in the future many other health risks that can emerge from such a source, and that we needed to know. And I found it disgraceful that there was a lack of willingness to cooperate by the Chinese government to help the world understand what was going on. Now, that came on the back of what I can only describe as a willfulness on the part of the Chinese government not to disclose what was occurring in the back end of 2019. I mean, it's called COVID-19 for a reason. It didn't happen in 2020. It happened in 2019. And the the real challenges we had in those first few months and the absence of any clear information that was coming out of China, I have no doubt led to the unnecessary deaths of large numbers of people. And so it just seemed right and just that part of our response to COVID-19 was finding out what the hell happened.
And one of the fallouts from that was that China replied with the 14 demands. There were the trade sanctions, which have now recently been released, which I believe for copper and coal. How do you see the future of the relationship between the two countries?
Well, this didn't happen in isolation to events that have been going back several years now at this point. I mean, Australia was being coerced by China before the pandemic.
Yeah.
So this wasn't new. And Australia had been leading the world in standing up to that coercion. Countries like Lithuania had also, I think, shown a great deal of strength and resilience. And the United States, of course, has big enough and strong enough to always, take those positions. But Australia was being put to the test. And it wasn't just our sovereignty that was at risk from this. It was far bigger than that. If Australia was to buckle to this pressure, then that would have green-lighted, I think, that approach to many more nations in our region. And we decided to say no and to resist. Now, we knew that would come at some cost, but the alternative was unthinkable. In the past, we had seen China continue to push the envelope, push the boundaries when it established its presence with installations in the South China Sea, which are now basically military installations, which they said they never would be, and they're basically stationary aircraft carriers now, because no one said no. There was a policy of acquiescence, I think, that was ruling at that time in global affairs. I said, no, we're not copying that, and my predecessor did as well. And so we acted on a whole range of fronts, from technology to trade to investment and so on, the impact on our society, the Confucius Institutes, all of this, the potential of exposing of our research programs, etc. So we said no, and then the straw that I suppose broke the camel's back at the end of the day was when we called for the inquiry into COVID, which was an entirely responsible and rational thing to do. And the reaction of the Chinese government to basically those 14 points, when you read them, they're quite chilling. I mean, what they object to is a country deciding who can invest in their own country, the freedom of speech of their parliamentarians and the press. These are things that sit at the core of our democracy, and they take issue with them, because China basically says to the rest of the world, look, we'll make you rich, but you got to do what we say and not complain about what we do. And I wasn't copying that deal.
Approaching terms, we're just heading into our final question. This is one of our submitted in questions by our listeners. They ask, after passing the Foreign Relations Bill in 2020, which required states to get federal government approval for any international programs, given how unique each Australian state is and the history of federal-state relationships, how much of the international engagement autonomy do you think state governments should have?
They can act only within the foreign affairs policy boundaries set by the federal government. That's all they can do. They cannot go outside those boundaries. They have no responsibilities for international relations, and they must work within the lines. And that's exactly what we insisted upon, because we had seen the Chinese government in other places as well seek to undermine national foreign policies with China by bypassing them and going to provincial administrations, which is what they'd done here in Australia, particularly in Victoria. And this was not consistent with Australia's national interests of having a unified and singular foreign policy. And we took very strong action to change that.
Mr. Morrison, thank you so much for joining Talking Foreign Affairs. We appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to share some of your highlights as Prime Minister and the difficult decisions in diplomacy. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for the opportunity to come and share these thoughts.